Under the bruised sky of a prairie evening, Colt McGraw stood alone, a shadow against the settling gold of the horizon. He was a man who carried both the grandeur and the sorrow of his size, 6.5 feet of rugged bone and sinew that seemed forged by the land itself. Some whispered he was a giant born too late for myths, others said his silence made him stranger than his height ever could. He knew only that wherever he walked, gazes followed, then shifted away in unease, as though his presence carried a weight too heavy for ordinary company. The prairie wind curled around him like a companion, whispering secrets he half wished he could forget, and half feared to understand. Yet it was not the wind that drew him from solitude that night, it was the sound of voices raised in terror, soft and sharp against the dusk, like startled birds fleeing from the brush. He moved toward it with a slow certainty, his long strides covering ground as the dry grass hissed under his boots. By a dried riverbed, the firelight of desperation burned, 2 young women, cornered by rough outlaws whose laughter rang more cruel than the empty plain around them. The younger clutched her sister's arm, eyes wide with disbelief, while the older stood tall despite the tremor in her hands. Colt did not rush. He stepped forward as if carved from calm stone. His shadow fell over the scene before his voice did. One man turned, jeering, but the sound died in his throat when he looked up at the looming figure. Colt said nothing. His silence, coupled with the breadth of his frame, carried more threat than any pistol could. The outlaws faltered, muttering curses as they stumbled back into the dark. The plain swallowed their footsteps, leaving only the sound of 2 women breathing, shaken but unbroken. The elder woman met his gaze, her eyes like flint struck against night. There was gratitude there, but it was buried beneath wariness, a sharp question held in her silence. Her name, as he would soon learn, was Winona. The younger was Ayesha, softer in her gaze, yet her whisper trembled as she spoke to her sister, calling Colt a giant as though he were a half-remembered legend from their stories. Colt shifted, uneasy under their watch. He knew the fear in their eyes. It was the same he had seen too often before. Even when his hands had saved, even when his heart had meant no harm, his sighs spoke louder than his soul. He tipped his hat, turned to leave, but Winona's voice stopped him. She did not thank him. She did not smile. She only asked his name. And in that simple question lay both suspicion and a flicker of something else, something that tightened the breath in his chest. The next day, the earth rumbled with hooves. A band of riders approached, their paint and feathers stark against the morning sun. Colt tensed, knowing full well what it meant for him to stand among the Comanche after crossing their path. At their head was Chief Red Bear, father of Winona and Ayesha. The air thickened with unspoken judgment, and Colt braced himself, half expecting blame or challenge. The chief's gaze lingered long upon him, as though measuring not only the breadth of his shoulders but the weight of his soul. The silence stretched until it became a trial. And then, unexpectedly, the chief spoke not of anger, but of offering. Winona, he said, was of age, and she had been spared through Colt's strength. If Colt would stay, if he would join their people, then he could take her as his wife. Or he could walk away, leaving behind not only her safety but the quiet chance that had risen between them. Colt's heart clenched at the strangeness of it. He had spent his years as an outsider, too large for the rooms of men, too silent for their laughter. To be offered a place, a wife, a life, it was more than he could hold. Yet he looked at Winona and saw no easy acceptance in her. Her chin lifted in quiet defiance, her eyes sparking with something more complicated than duty. It was not her father's will she waited for, it was her own measure of him. Colt lowered his gaze, shame pressing against his ribs. He had been a wanderer, a man with no root, no kin, no legacy. How could he claim her, who deserved more than his silence and his scarred solitude? The prairie wind stirred again, carrying away his words before they could form, leaving only his hesitation, as heavy as stone between them. Days passed, each one a test written in small gestures. Colt remained near their camp, not as a suitor, but as a worker. He mended broken fences, hauled water from the river, and tended to the horses with quiet reverence. He asked for nothing, not even a kind glance. Yet Winona saw him, though she tried to hide it. She saw the clumsiness in his hands as he tried to shape wood the way their men did, the humility in his posture when others judged him. She noticed how he moved slowly near the children, as if afraid his size might frighten them. And at night, when the firelight cast shadows long and flickering, she would find her gaze drifting toward where he sat alone, his silence speaking more than any man's words. Something in her heart shifted, though she told herself it was only curiosity, only watchfulness. Yet when he brought her horse water without a word, their fingers brushed, and the jolt it carried was harder to dismiss. Still, not all eyes were kind. Murmurs rippled through the camp. Some said he was too large, too strange, too pale to ever belong. They questioned the chief's wisdom, whispered that Winona would be wasted on a man who could not speak their tongue, who carried no blood of their people. Winona bore these whispers with a stiff spine, but each word pressed upon her like stones. Colt, hearing them though they were not meant for him, felt the old wound reopen, the wound of never being enough. One night he stood by the riverbank, ready to leave as quietly as he had come. But Winona followed, her steps urgent. She did not beg with words. She only reached out, her hand trembling as it touched his arm, holding him there. In her silence, he felt the truth. Leaving would not protect her, it would only wound them both. He stayed, not because he believed himself worthy, but because her hand gave him no other choice. Their closeness grew not in sudden confessions but in the slow rhythm of days. Winona began teaching him words of her tongue, her laughter softening when his deep voice stumbled over syllables. He, in turn, crafted a bracelet from simple leather, rough yet earnest, and placed it in her hands. She did not mock it, she wore it. One night, as the fire dimmed and the camp fell into quiet, she pressed her palm to his chest, feeling the steady drum of his heart. They spoke no vow, but in that touch lay a promise older than speech. Their bond had already grown roots, unseen but strong, binding them before either dared to name it. At last, dawn broke upon the day chosen for them. There was no grandeur, no crowding spectacle, only family, fire, and song. Winona's eyes shone steady as she stood before him, her hand finding his without hesitation. The villagers, at first distant, softened when they saw not conquest but humility in the way he looked at her. The ceremony passed like a breath, yet its weight was eternal. For Colt, who had lived in the shadow of rejection, to stand beside her was not triumph but salvation. For Winona, it was not duty but choice, the quiet victory of a heart that had learned to trust. As the first rays of the sun broke across the plain, gilding them in fragile light, Colt knew the battles of his life had led to this union, this belonging, this chance at peace. And though their life would not be without hardship, he understood something deeper than hope. Love was not the blaze of a gunfight, nor the roar of a crowd. It was the small, steady flame of two souls choosing each other, again and again. Perhaps that was why, as he tightened his grip on her hand, he found himself smiling, not the smile of a man who had won, but of a man finally, blessedly, home. And if you, wanderer of words, have ever felt too much, too strange, too apart from the world, then hear this truth whispered across time. Sometimes it takes only one steady hand reaching through silence to make a giant feel small enough to be loved, and strong enough to belong.